Hello and welcome. In this video what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at interpreting Orson Welles' film Citizen Kane. Now, believe it or not, this is actually a relatively simple film to study, and compared to a lot of other films that you may look at, it has a lot of very overstated sort of techniques and motives. And it's one where there's very obvious kinds of symbolism and themes and ideas, which actually it has been criticised for by some small sections, I must admit, of the critical community. Now, the overstated techniques basically means it's much easier to identify what techniques the film uses. And so while the story of the film may appear convoluted at times, and certainly it is a difficult film to sort of understand in terms of a story sense, but the use of such obvious themes and motifs makes deeper the discussion, should I say, about the film much easier to develop than perhaps another sort of film. So really, if you are lucky enough to be studying Citizen Kane, there are a lot of techniques in there which are very easy to discuss, and obviously you would start with probably the two main ones, which would be the sled of Rosebud, and also of this this idea of reflection, and certainly a number of other motifs, this motif of loss, this motif of the American dream. There's so many ideas which are very strongly represented, and even the film techniques and devices which are used to tell these sorts of stories are quite obvious and quite dramatic, and so to be able to write about them is actually fairly simple as compared to probably a more subtle type of film. Alright, now let's start with probably the most important theme and idea of this film, which is loss. And loss is a prominent idea because it does actually really frame the film. Now what I mean by that is the entire film is almost about Kane's loss. And certainly when we talk about the beginning, we've got the beginning where he mentions this thing he's lost, this rosebud, where the meaning of that word is lost. And certainly we discover that Kane is pretty much a lost soul. His character is full of loss. He suffers a loss of childhood, so he doesn't have his childhood. It's ripped away from him to be schooled, to be given wealth, to be given training and all these different aspects of his life. He's lost his contentment with life. He's lost the ability to be happy. And he is literally, as I said, a lost soul. He's someone who by the end of the film walks around his mansion not knowing what to do next. He seems to have nothing. He has all these wonderful and fabulous objects and yet doesn't want to play. It's like he has a ton of toys in his bedroom and he doesn't want to play with any of them because they don't mean anything to him. And yet he sees a little boy with a broken old teddy bear on the street, and that young boy, even though he's only got one toy as opposed to thousands of toys, values that one toy more than Kane would value any other toy in that collection. That's pretty much an analogy for what his loss is like. And this is best represented by this large empty mansion, as I mentioned before, filled with expensive and yet quite, to him, worthless items. And the fact that most of them sit in boxes in his basement next to the furnace, next to the incinerator, and these are valuable works of art, valuable sculptures, valuable items and various other things that he has, most of them don't actually go on display. They just sort of sit there. And it's actually a bit of a comment about Hearst as well, because Hearst actually did the same sort of thing. So there is a bit of a representation of the character it's loosely based on. But certainly in the case of Kane, we sort of see this opulence, which is so grand and so almost over the top that it means nothing to him anymore. And having all the money in the world doesn't buy him, as the old adage says, a skerrick of happiness. Now, prosperity, obviously, this is something that goes directly and leads directly from loss. And it is a film about prosperity, and it's ultimately about the hollowness of Kane's fortune. And certainly an aspect of the American dream is represented here as well, as the American dream is to earn money and to be prosperous. And that Kane, ironically, despite filling his life with grand luxuries, is, as I mentioned before, happiest when he was a little poor boy, someone who didn't have a lot of wealth but was content playing with a sled in the snow. And certainly having all this power, all this wealth and all this luxury certainly didn't give him any happiness that having a sled did not have to him. And it reflects a discontent with the American dream. And certainly it's something that appears quite often in contrast with a lot of American ideals, particularly at the time, that everyone from pretty much anyone who lived on the street, anyone who lived anywhere, wanted to have the biggest house in the neighborhood, wanted to have wealth and power and luxury and all those sorts of things. And here we see someone who has all of that being more miserable than any of them. And so it is a bit of a sort of a, I guess, a contrast to what the idealistic version of the American dream is, where people thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to live in luxury, to not work, to do all these things, and yet someone who has it feels utterly miserable. And it's sort of something that, again, is a bit of a contrast in the film. Okay, so let's look at this image now of Rosebud. Now, Rosebud obviously is something that ties the film together and connects basically the beginning of the film to the end. Now, as a device, not only is it quite a obvious symbol, and certainly an obvious symbol of his childhood, but we also get this sort of framing device that allows the film to move from one thing to the next. And certainly the fact that the film is about a reporter who is investigating Kane's life in regards to this object certainly shows what sort of a symbol and device it is. Now, in terms of the actual meaning of the word rosebud, and I dug this out in a little bit of research, is something I can't actually repeat on camera here. It is quite risque in the sense that it was an inside joke between Welles and Mankiewicz, who was the screenwriter for the film. And so it was this device which they basically used as something, and they almost actually removed the sled from the film. But they decided to keep it as a framing device and to sort of help it move from one bit to the next. Now, obviously, it marks the most prominent idea in the film that Kane's life of excess and power is one that held absolutely zero happiness for him, or not absolutely zero, but very little happiness for him. And as this tiny little sled, this seemingly worthless object, that sort of represents the power of what happiness actually is. And certainly, when you look at the media empire and all these things which people consider of value, by discussing things like sensationalist media and yellow journalism, things which are inventing and exaggerating the truth quite often, we see that this sort of thing, this excess, this exaggeration, often takes away from the things that are important. And certainly in this case, we see that with the sled. The mystery is also something that engages the audience, and certainly it's one of the things that sort of keeps people watching, and it sort of follows that mystery genre, which I guess sort of gets heightened a little bit with film noir, but it's a mystery that drives the film, and certainly it's a mystery where people sort of want to know, okay, what is Rosebud? What's the whole point behind this film? So it's something that, as well as being a symbolic object, is an object which helps to engage the audience and keep them interested until the end, where we do see what Rosebud actually is. Now, Kane is a film where power is represented in a unique sort of way as well. So when we're looking at power in this film, it is a sense of power which is almost done through mistruth, and certainly Kane's newspaper sells by manipulating the truth and by sensationalizing news. In other words, he's gaining power by exaggeration, by making himself or making his paper seem more newsworthy, by seeming more important, and by the money it earns, by the amount of attention that it gains, and by sort of the lines that he starts to mention. For instance, he talks about the Spanish War and pretty much indicates this amount of power, that the Spanish War doesn't start until we say it does, not the government, but until the media says that it starts, because that's the only time that people will actually believe it has started. It's that manipulation of truth that basically, because of the fact that it's news, it's the only way people can get information, at least about current events, that having power over that medium allows him to pretty much say and do whatever he wants. And certainly this was one of the things that, I guess if you're looking at a more modern equivalent, if you're looking at Murdoch's empire, there's been similar accusations that's been leveled by that newspaper, by having this way of having power over the way that people receive information. We get a sense that people can bend and manipulate the truth in such ways that it suits their own interests and their own values. And certainly that's where you get the idea of that journalism is biased and journalism is either left-wing or right-wing and all those sorts of things. And it sort of all stems from ideas which have been raised in this film. And in this case, Kane intends to use it for some sort of good. He extends his power into politics, and not to further his control, because he has control already, one must be said. He also wants to be liked by people, and certainly he sort of gets addicted to people wanting to turn to him and his newspapers for information, and he sort of almost wants to be looked at as someone who does great good and wants to be considered a visionary, someone who can change the world. And so by getting into politics, he believes he can change the world in areas that having power in the media won't do for him. Now, as I mentioned before, this idea of yellow journalism is quite a prominent idea in the film, and it's something that sort of reflects the hollowness of and sort of sensationalism of media and as it was becoming. As different businessmen started to control newspapers, when it started to be controlled by a variety of different organizations and groups who suddenly saw the allure of money and certainly saw that papers could make money, and certainly the only way that newspapers could, stimulate circulation in order to not only keep themselves viable but to also make money, was to start to sensationalize things, make things leap off the page and demand that people passing by were to pay their money and buy the newspaper. Now, it's far more accepted, of course, in the modern field, and certainly when we look at news journalism now, we think of it as being sensationalist. And in this case, it also refers to sort of puff pieces of journalism, which reflect entertainment rather than journalistic integrity. In other words, people want to read the newspaper because it's something that helps them to get away from things, and they don't want to be bored by politics or by other sorts of things. And it's an idea which has been repeated quite a bit through news and through media, particularly after this film is made, and certainly way through the rest of the 20th century, and certainly now in the 21st century. And so we get this idea that news and news journalism is about this entertainment, and certainly it's one of the things that sort of is a point of conflict in the film, is that when Kane changes this newspaper, he turns it into this entertainment piece, and he certainly has a life that's about entertainment, and certainly through this excess and power and all those sorts of things, he's able to sort of show entertainment in a different, or be able to make news his own brand of entertainment. And so in this sense, we sort of get this feeling that yellow journalism is purely for the purpose of not only grabbing attention, but to essentially entertain its readers and to give them something that they want to read. Now, at the end of the film, we get probably another of these most prominent themes about Kane's character, which is isolation. And even though he's backed by so many people and he has so many friends, so many companions in his earlier life, and especially in the newspaper business, he has lots of friends and he's a likable character. At the end of the film, he starts to isolate himself, particularly as he feels that he's unable to trust, and especially the affair with Susan Alexander, where his political campaign is blown open by details of that affair leaking out to the press. The press he doesn't own, that is. He sort of starts to isolate and distrust things, and certainly he feels a sense of misery that he can never make himself happy, that all of these things he's done is not making him happy, and this causes his own isolation, and the fact that he can never be happy is something that isolates him. You could also say this is something that is represented sort of in various other parts of the film as well. For instance, the breakfast table with his first wife, Emily, where jump cuts show him becoming more and more distant, and the first sort of scene in the little montage, I suppose you can call it, he and his wife are quite close, and he and his son are quite close, and by the end of it, they're almost completely at different ends of the table and almost not speaking to each other, and that sort of shows him growing apart from different people in his life. And certainly this is a process that repeats itself when we're talking about Susan and the things that occur in her life as well. And so this isolation, his removal of people, is pretty much him wanting to be that little boy playing by himself again. And I think this idea of isolation is one that's quite powerful in the film, and certainly reflects the sad, lonely man that we sort of get to know, particularly in the back end of the film, and as he starts to, I guess, succumb to his desire to be happy again. And that's pretty much it for the main ideas of the film. So until next time, I'll see you later.